the main focus of this is how filmmakers address economic injustice through storytelling. So I just wanted to start off and ask Kristi, you know, after having watched your incredible film, can you talk about the inception of it, and what was your catalyst for making it, and what event inspired you to tell this story?
Sure. The inspiration for the film really is a young girl named Sabrina, who my co-director, Laurie Silverbush, was a big sister sort of mentor to. And she was part of a family of about eight siblings. And at the time, when Laurie started mentoring her, they lived all together in a house, and ultimately over time they were at one point in a shelter. And Laurie just started seeing just all these different little signs. You know, Sabrina would not eat an entire meal, but would pack it up and take it home. And when, you know, Laurie would ask her later, it wasn't because she wasn't hungry and she couldn't eat it, it was because she was feeding the rest of her family with that. And she also started having a lot of problems in school. And once Laurie started putting two and two together, she's actually a writer and a narrative filmmaker, she came to me and started talking to me about it. And once we started researching and started to sort of understand the problem of hunger here in America, frankly, for me as a filmmaker, it just became a story I couldn't not tell. You know, as a filmmaker, you ultimately, you know, throw all of yourself, or at least I do, into films. Karin and I were speaking about that earlier. And when I realized just how it affected the entire nation, well, as you saw in the film, but also individuals, and it's such a personal issue, we just realized that this film needed to be made, the story needed to be told. And most important is that it's not just about, we didn't want to just make a film about who goes hungry in America. That in and of itself is upsetting and shocking and surprising to learn, of course, that so many working people are struggling, but why? And we felt that that hadn't been done in a long time, in fact, not since 1968, when that film aired on CBS. And that was really very early in the making of the film. We met with Dr. Mariana Chilton, who, by the way, is an alum of Harvard, and started spending time with the witnesses. And just watch that film. You know, the few first conversations we had, it told us you need to see that film. And when we saw, because we're talking about impact, the impact that that film had, we thought, you know, let's try and do that. Let's shoot for very big goals. And that's sort of, I guess, the inception.
Great. And you mentioned that this is your first screening outside of Sundance and kind of the festival circuit. So can you talk to us a little bit about what your dream is, your kind of wildest dream for the impact of the film, and your plan to kind of carry that out now?
I'd say that, you know, wildest dream is to end hunger in America. Sort of more specifically, I'd say in the immediate, is to put this issue front and center, in particular with the upcoming elections. What we really need to do is protect the funding for food stamps, first and foremost. And I mean, I could go on and on, but one other dream would be to eliminate food deserts, to help people understand the relationship between obesity and hunger, and to also improve the child nutrition program. So those are just a few things, but getting it out there and making it an issue that people care about and that people demand their representatives in the United States government do something about is probably our difficult to measure goal.
Great, and one of the things that we talked about in kind of exploring what this panel would be about is there's a lot of aspiring filmmakers here in the crowd. And one of the things that we talked about was balancing making a film for advocacy versus working within the medium of documentaries and really telling compelling stories. Can you talk a little bit about that and how you balance those two dynamics?
Yeah, I think that challenge is one that any filmmaker making a film that they hope will make a difference is going to face daily. And the big challenge for us from the outset was that we wanted to make, and I hope that we succeeded, a very personal film, a film that moved people in their heart and in their core. But at the same time, it was important, and we cared about the stories, and we also cared about the craft. And also we worked with Participant, and we're very lucky in that they've done this successfully many times, and Diane Wireman, our executive, really always held our feet to the fire in that we needed to make the best film possible, be the best storytellers we could be. But then there was also context and information that without which, perhaps the stories wouldn't resonate as much. So I guess we made a priority to find stories that we felt were going to illuminate the issue. We then, I think, critically important was we did not stay like this, like, okay, this is the film that we want to make. We wanted to say these 3 things, and this is how it's going to work. Once we started filming, we saw that the characters and the stories were taking us on their own journey, and we allowed that to happen. And I believe that that's essential in making a strong film, and maybe the difference between making an advocacy film. We're going to hit this point, and this point. But at the end of the day, both Lori and I would say there's a ton more information that we wanted to put in the film. But it would have been at the expense of moving people and telling a story that hopefully stands on its own as a piece of cinema. And we also were really fortunate, I don't know if anybody here enjoyed the music, but I do. And we were fortunate to work with, for example, a wonderful, amazing producer and composer in T-Bone Burnett. So we were able to do and work with great cinematographers, and so do those things that hopefully contribute to a cinematic experience for audiences, while also, hopefully serving the bigger goal of motivating audiences to take action and care.
When I completed my last film, I had a childhood friend say to me, it was an incredible film, but there's a couple of things I would have done differently. And I said, there's a couple of things I would have done differently myself. Can you just talk about, maybe 1 thing or 2 things that were left out of the film that you really wish that you could have touched on?
Gosh, I have this mechanism going where once the film locks, I think that every decision we made had to have been the best decision, because otherwise I would be tossing and turning like into eternity. But I think that sort of taking the conversation, in the film you heard, and also this is sort of segueing to the other film that we're here for. You heard Marion Nestle say, as long as corporations fund elections, where it's going to be hard to solve these problems. And I think that taking that conversation to the next level was something that we were tempted to do, to go into further exploration there. But again, just try and stay really focused on the issue of hunger and the people's stories in the film. We hoped that would be part of the conversation instead. And I gather, having not seen this film, that there's some other people doing that, and we're happy for that. So I guess, that's one thing. There's also other people and stories that we filmed, people who were really courageous and shared their stories in Alabama and in suburban Connecticut who weren't able to be featured in the film. So that's always hard. People share their stories with you, and you have to ultimately make some decisions in the edit room to keep the thing together.
Thank you, and that's a really timely issue, obviously, and something that's touched upon in great detail, and We're Not Broke, and something that I can't wait for everybody to see. I just wanted to speak to Alicia now. Alicia works with Share Our Strength and Billy Shore, and I just wanted to get your opinion after having seen the film, having worked on this topic for so long. What really resonated most with you about the film?
So much resonated with that film. I think what I found most powerful about something like this is, all of you just had the experience where you just saw that. You can't unsee that. That's something that just happened, and you now have a certain responsibility to kind of bear witness to what you just saw. And I think the work that I get to do on a regular basis, I kind of work on our education side of things with Share Our Strength, and have the opportunity to work with low-income families and help teach them how to make some different choices and how to maximize the food resources they have in the healthiest ways possible so their kids can thrive. And I get to hear a lot of stories, and that's something that I feel very privileged about. And so I think anytime you have the ability in these films to have it become a little bit more real, and to hear some of the voices and then possibly add your own voice. I think one of the things when you're talking about hunger and when you're talking about kids, you're talking about the ones that don't have the voices when it comes to the political machine and the decisions and all of that. And so then it really becomes our role to step in and lend our voice to the conversation. And I think in many times through the film, I certainly notice whenever our little orange Share Our Strength apple pops up onto things. But I think there were a few times when I saw mention of like the No Kid Hungry campaign that Share Our Strength is doing nationally. And the whole idea of that is, can you connect families to the food? And what part of access can we work on? Access and education, kind of the two things that we need to make sure that no kid goes hungry. So I think anytime we can illuminate the conversation around that with these images is critical to pushing that forward.
Great, and now that the film is finished and we're looking for kind of outreach programs, how would you envision the best utilization of this kind of to have a greater impact after the festival circuit and after it airs on TV, and how might you consider using it in your work?
Wow, that's a great question. I guess I go back to storytelling, and I go back to any time that you can share those stories. Share Our Strength actually has a storyteller on staff. We have a paid person who their whole job is to tell the stories, and she does little video vignettes and photo things, and so I would imagine anytime you can kind of get these images and these stories in front of people, I would love this to be screened as like the thing that every freshman entering college has to see. I think anytime you can get those, tap into that activism and the folks that are so ripe for activism, and that seems like a great population. And can we screen it to every person in Congress? I think there's so many levels that you want people to see it, from kind of agribusiness to lobbyists to moms to kids to, can you get it in the high-income schools and the low-income schools? I think as many people and as much breadth as you can, as many different perspectives possible. Hunger is one of those issues where we see a little bit of the fighting and the trying to balance the budgets, but by and large, it really does have bipartisan support. There's not a lot of people that will stand up there and say, you know what, I really don't want a kid to have enough food to eat. And so when you can tap into that, it really opens up your possibility. Kind of hearing where you had wished that maybe the film went, I'm actually kind of glad it didn't. Because I feel like hunger is a poverty issue, it's a health issue, of course it's a political issue, but I think where it is right now, it's so grounded in just that reality that this isn't acceptable. And when you get enough people to stand up there and say, you know what, this isn't acceptable, that's where the politics are going to come out. That's where the larger scale change is going to happen.
And as a layperson who's not really involved in these kind of issues and found the film, really enlightening, it's kind of counterintuitive. I mean, you assume that Congress and all of our leaders know about these issues. So saying that you want all of Congress to see that, I mean, why do you think that the change is not happening? What do you think are the greatest kind of social or political, hurdles to having something change in this issue?
I think it comes back to the voice. That's not the voice of the constituent. It should be, but that's not the one that's usually the loudest. It's not the one that's got the lobbying budget behind it. It's not the one that's picking up the phone and calling them to tell them to vote a particular way on a particular issue. And until that voice is elevated, I don't actually think you're going to get, I mean, there's so many issues out there, and there's so many things that are pulling at folks' attention. And so I think when folks go into that role of public service, it then becomes our job to make sure that they're making choices and listening to the things we want them to hear. And if folks with really large lobbying budgets have a much louder bullhorn than the kid in front of the empty fridge in Philadelphia, I don't know the message is going to get across quite so loud as it needs to be.
Well, I think that that's a perfect segue to move into We're Not Broke. I could set up the film, but it'd probably be a little bit easier to have Karin do that. And if you can just tell us very briefly the brief synopsis about the film we're about to watch, and maybe a little bit about the inception and how you came to wanting to tell this story.
I'll start with the inception for We're Not Broke. And that came to us, I made the film with another person, Vicky Bruce, and our executive producer, Charles Davidson, who's here and actually is the reason that the film was made, he can wave if he wants to, a big thank you to him, is that he approached Vicky and has been working on the subject for many, many years, the subject of tax justice and corporate transparency around tax justice and how this is affecting the global economy and tax havens, offshore tax havens, all of those things. And he approached Vicky and asked her to write a book, and then they decided that a film might be something that could get out sooner than a book. And so then we began on this process really of discovery, because neither Vicky nor I had ever embarked on a project, or even I had not spent my spare time looking into what's going on with offshore tax havens and what corporations are doing with their taxes, et cetera. And so we began this process of discovery, really. And the film started in one direction. We were going to follow a Swiss whistleblower and his story, and then talk about offshore tax havens. But then the film, as they often do with documentaries, totally took another turn. And February, we started the film in 2010, the fall of 2010, and in February of 2011, we had done a lot of expert interviews, and at that point we had still been going down the road of looking at individuals, people who are doing scams like Ponzi schemes, and then the corporations, and those three aspects. But then in February of 2011, we came across a group called US Uncut, who was a group of people inspired by an organization called UK Uncut, who was protesting corporate tax dodging. And those people started springing up around the country in February of 2011, and we immediately connected with someone in Jackson, Mississippi, who had been inspired by the UK branch. And what they were doing was they were going out and doing protests, creative protests, in front of corporations that had not been paying their fair share of taxes, perfectly legal technically, under our current laws. But we found that this was a way that we could really connect the corporation, what was going on in the corporate world, and the corporate tax loopholes that existed with the everyday person. Because it's easy if you learn about an individual who's a tax dodger, you might be able to say, oh, well, that's just that one person, and that's their story, but there's no real relation to me. But then as we started looking at large corporations and how our system of corporate tax loopholes is allowing them to get away with not paying any taxes to the U.S. It's affecting the revenue of our country, which is in effect, I was reminded when I saw Finding North, it's in effect completely connected with some of the issues that Finding North broaches. So that was kind of the journey, and I think I forgot the other part of the question. But that's how we got to the point of focusing on corporations.
Okay, great. And you also just completed the festival circuit as well, and are just getting ready to kind of launch the film into the world, right?
The only time it's been screened is at Sundance with Finding North. So that was our first festival. It's going to be continuing on to some other festivals. The Independent Film Festival Boston is one that it's going to be coming to. I believe it's in April. And then we're talking about other ideas and ways to get it out there.
Great, and this is a really timely issue. I know that I read yesterday that President Obama released something that he was saying that he's going to push for a 28% tax cut, or a tax cut to 28% for corporations, and then try to close a lot of the loopholes that you're looking at in your movie. And given what's happening with Occupy Wall Street and the Great Recession and all these things, it's obviously a tremendously timely topic. So can you talk to us a little bit about what your hopes are in terms of the impact of the release of the film?
Our number one initial hope is to get people attuned to the issue. Because I myself, as I said, and even as we went into some screenings, we had some high school screenings at Sundance, we were thinking, oh gosh, what are high school students, what are they going to think about a film that deals with taxes? Is that going to be completely boring? Or, because as I was making the film and I would tell friends, oh, I'm doing this film about offshore tax havens and taxes, and my friends would either tell me they were getting completely stressed out thinking about their own taxes, or they were totally bored. And so we were worried about how would it actually engage people. So one of our big hopes is, number one, to get people to become aware of the issue and kind of start to look and see why are certain things the way they are in our country right now, and looking behind issues like the issue of hunger, and why isn't there enough money to fund these school programs, and where is the money, and is there money, and asking sorts of questions like that. And then taking it further, we want to take it to the policy level of being able to close tax loopholes that are existing, and being able to I forgot what the other part was, but that's being able to close the tax loopholes and taking it to a policy level of the financing that's going into campaigns. And as they were talking about as well, that a lot of the corporate money going to finance the campaigns, then the candidates are beholden to their financiers, et cetera, in not such a simplistic way, but talking about how do we reform what's going on with the system, because right now things are not working in the way that we wanted, and the corporations are beginning to take hold of the democracy, whereas really it's government by the people for the people. So it's about bringing it back to we are the government, and how do we get re-involved in that?
Great. And Jim, can you tell us a little bit about what you do as your work relates to this film, and kind of what resonated most with you after watching the film?
Sure. Well, my background is investigative journalism, economics, and law, and I'm on the board of an organization called Tax Justice International. We've been a thorn in the side of major banks and accounting firms and law firms around the planet who make a practice of laundering as much money as they can, secreting it onshore and offshore, and protecting it against taxation. So one of the things I work on is causing trouble for those folks. This film, I think, is about ultimately about class war, and as Warren Buffett noted a couple years ago, that the class war wasn't declared by ordinary people. It was declared by the rich on us about 30 years ago. It's a great complement to the film we've just seen, which talks about the dire need for public spending and positive government action. And that's just one of a number of problems that we need to be doing that. But we have an answer to that problem, which is that if you look at major companies in this country and around the globe, they've had declining effective tax rates. The average for the top 100 companies is not 28%, but it's more like 3% over the last decade. And companies like Google and General Electric and Pfizer have been moving actively to park their technology and their activities offshore in untaxed jurisdictions, and they've accumulated more than $1 trillion of offshore profits that are sitting there untaxed. So one of the objectives of this film is to try to make all this comprehensible to regular Americans who have absolutely no idea that this is going on. So corporate tax is one of the most complicated areas you ever want to tackle, but this isn't really about corporate tax. It's about tax justice and about all the things we're not able to fund because this system is in place.
One of the commonalities that we were talking about and kind of exploring these two films is that large corporations and big business is getting lots of relief and subsidies, but individuals are not. And that's one of the things that that's really explored in We're Not Broke. And given that that's the case, and as another layperson on this topic, that obviously seems kind of counterintuitive to the welfare and state of our country. And what do you think the biggest political or social opposition is to having some change happen in this field, and how could the film potentially add to that?
Well, I think both films have the same storyline on that, or the same analysis ultimately. And one of the good things about our film, and I think also the Finding North, is that both films managed to be offensive to both political parties in a very exciting and dramatic way. So we've raised an issue which is kind of the same thing that has motivated Tax Uncut and people in the Occupy movement, which is that Washington has been for sale and that it has been overly responsive. We have effectively given corporations the right to spend unlimited amounts of money on our political system and in lobbying. At the same time, they're not paying taxes. So effectively, we have representation without taxation for some of the largest companies in the world and the wealthiest ones. And we think that's at the root of a lot of the issues. It's the root of the hunger problem we heard about. It's at the root of the influence that industries like nuclear and healthcare, insurance are having, defense. And it's also at the root of this corporate tax injustice problem.
Given that that's the case, what do you think the best potential is for this film to be utilized and have an impact on that issue?
Well, there's Susan Sontag wrote a book about her last book regarding the pain of others. And I think one of the points she makes is that it's not enough to be a witness to suffering or to injustice. You have an obligation, in fact, you have no right to be a witness to suffering and injustice unless you do something about it. And these films, I think, in a dramatic way, if you spend the time with them, they will, I live in Sag Harbor. Pennybacker lives down the street from me. He's made 57 documentaries. And he says a film is successful is you go in one way and you come out another. And I think these films, you go in and you come out with a different view and a different set of issues that you're concerned about, and a common understanding that you can build on. So it's not just about an individual experience. It's about being able to link up with other people who've had the same experience and in a relatively short period of time and feel upset about it, and then can come together and make change. So if we're successful, we'll be able to catalyze that kind of reaction.
Great, and with that in mind, I think it's time to open up the floor to some questions from some people in the audience. If you can just raise your hand and we'll get a microphone to you, and if you can just start by just telling us who you are and if you're a student or a aspiring filmmaker or a filmmaker.
Thank you. Do I need to stand or?
Sure.
I'm Kent Blossel, father of 4 young children, going to school in Groton, a chef, fan of Alice Waters, her efforts to get better nutrition in the schools. I thank you for making the movie. I'm not of the opinion, however, that I could come up with a solution politically, economically, address some of those very large, complex issues. And one of the things that the film kind of touched on, but it really didn't get into, is nutrition. I've lived in China for 2 years. I've traveled the world. I've seen poverty in these other nations, and it doesn't manifest itself in the same ways that it does here in America. The Captain Crunch aisle is just as large in Groton as it is in poor neighborhoods. McDonald's is thriving in rich neighborhoods as much as it is in poor neighborhoods. My fear is that more money would just result in more distribution of Crunch-A-Munch, the sugary sodas, et cetera. It would just continue to perpetuate on a larger level the real hideous nutrition that we have in this country versus other areas that have a greater emphasis on fish, local vegetables, et cetera. And those other nations, greater funds would just increase what they're not getting enough of, but at least the diet is appropriate. Is nutrition going to be a part of what goes on here? More is not necessarily enough. We got to fundamentally change the diet.
Yeah.
And some people just prefer, even the kids, half of them still prefer potato chips to that honeydew melon. So anyway, it's a long question, but nutrition, I guess, is at the essence of it.
I just would say, I think you raise a great point, and you know, that's why, in many ways, we had that scene in there to sort of show how important education about nutrition is. And Sarah and I were talking earlier, and we're right now, sort of participant is working on gathering information from screenings like this, and with small groups of the various anti-hunger organizations to try and sort of figure out, because again, you can't put everything in the film, but you hope that it will bring people to the conversation and into the outreach portion. And Sarah and I were just talking about one idea, which is, is it microcredit loans? What? Microgrants. That would be for communities, for example, in Colburn, Colorado, if they were to get a small grant so that they could have refrigeration in order to have healthier foods, or have weekly, or partner with Share Our Strength to have weekly meetings about how to be, the system in and of itself is all about getting people to eat crappy food, because for a lot of reasons, right? So we need to work really hard to do both grassroots efforts and make systemic changes to re-gear it towards better nutrition and making sure that everybody has access to, not only access, but access to affordable, nutritious food. So, I think that is hopefully one of the takeaways that people will get.
Do you have anything to add, Alicia? Or?
I feel like I could talk for hours on this subject, and so I don't necessarily want to. But I think what I would say is, like my whole job is teaching people how to make nutritious choices, and how do you select the right ingredients, how do you prepare them in a way that kids will eat it, and how do you actually do that with whatever food resources you have. And I think one of the things that I found really interesting is just at the end of January, Share Our Strength released a study where we looked at the eating habits and the perceptions that low-income families had around food. And it's a study called It's Dinner Time. You can find it online. But one of the pieces of information that I found the most poignant from it is that of the 1,500 families kind of across the country that were surveyed, over 80% of them said, yeah, produce is incredibly healthy and fresh produce is so healthy. And that number dropped to 50% when you started talking about frozen. And it dropped down to 12% when you talked about canned. Now, I know there's a lot of canned food that maybe isn't that desirable, but come on, we're in Boston. Where are you gonna get a tomato in January that's worth eating? You're probably gonna get it out of a can. There's a lot of nutrition to be had in some of those foods, but unless people have the education, they don't necessarily know that. And if they've got food that's just being handed to them at a food pantry, there needs to be donor education. What do you put in that basket that's at the end of the grocery store aisle? Do you put in the Captain Crunch, or do you put in the no sodium added beans? And then when a family gets that butternut squash or whatever it is, do they actually know how to prepare it in a way that the 3-year-old's gonna eat it? And can a family look at a package that's got this nutrition facts label and actually decipher it and know what does that mean for them and for their mom that's hypertensive and for their kid that's pre-diabetic and for their other kid that's got food allergies? And how do you kind of navigate that with whatever dollars you've got in your budget that day to feed everybody? And meanwhile, this one's just crying because their belly hurts. you know, and so it's this very complex thing that, yeah, the nutrition is critical and they need that to thrive, but they also just need access, and you got to have the access, you got to have the education, and somewhere in there we've got to fill that gap.
My name's Marilyn Frankenstein. I teach at UMass Boston, and I teach quantitative reasoning and media and society and art and activism all mixed in together. And you did a very good job with the numbers in terms of the way you presented it. And my passion is tax justice. I don't know if you dealt with this in your movie yet. I'm really looking forward. But I think one of the blocks to tax justice is that people think somehow the rich earned it and deserved it. And the amount of our common wealth that has been stolen by the corporations and the rich is not made clear, so that is one of the impediments. I also think in your movie you began to deal with the issue that people like blame the poor for being poor, and well, they shouldn't have all those kids and things like that, and I think that was really good. In terms of another movie, say, that I've always, after every great documentary, and I think yours was great, and I'm really looking forward to yours, I always want the filmmaker to ask the people, particularly, for example, the white rural people, who'd you vote for? And I'm not saying Democrat, you know, what type of action do you take? Because I think that it would be really an interesting documentary to explore that gap between what's happening in people's lives. Even to show them stuff like about the tax issues, to show them what's being stolen from them, like that guy in Robert Greenwald's, I'll finish in a minute, Walmart documentary at the beginning, Esprit, who has, you know, they get it, but I don't know how far they get it. I don't know how they get it in tax policy as a whole. You know, they get that Walmart got the subsidies and they couldn't get a subsidy, and so they shut down. And maybe a documentary like that has been made, but tell me about it.
I just had one. Did you have a question?
No,
Or- I just wanted to. There was something that you said earlier that I had wanted to pick up on when you'd asked about a point that couldn't be told in the film, and I'd mentioned the corporations, and you said, well, you were relieved on some level. I just wanted to bring up, because we're talking about the intersection between making films and making films that can make a difference, one reason why that wasn't in the film was because we were having conversations with a number of organizations fighting to end hunger. And I think that that's just something that's been an interesting, when you talked about challenges, is that when we set out to make the film, because there's so much incredible energy around the possibilities of films as transformative, things that can help make a difference. In order to get funding to make a documentary about something, often you need to show how you're going to be able to impact the issue from the outset. And that's something for any aspiring filmmakers in the room that at first seems daunting. Like, I have to figure out how to make the film and how to make the film have impact before I've even made the film. Whoa, this seems overwhelming. But at the same time, what the effect of it was, at least in the case of this film, was that we started having conversations with organizations that are, you know, maybe there's 5 or 10 of the most, you know, the biggest, most important organizations working nationally, which you know, have also many local organizations as part of those bigger groups. We, for example, when we were just in production, had a meeting at a group called the Alliance to End Hunger, which of course is an alliance of a number of organizations, and at the room was someone from Share Our Strength, and someone from Feeding America, and someone from Food Research Action Center, and someone from Why Hunger, and all these people. And we said, we want to make a film that is going to be useful, and you guys are the experts, you've been doing this for many decades. And a lot of people at the table said, we've never actually sat in a room together to have a conversation like this. And so it informed our filmmaking, yet it didn't define it. And we were always really clear about saying, for example, we were not making a film for Share Our Strength or for Feeding America or for any organization. in particular, not one organization, but we wanted to make a film that would be valuable to all the different organizations, regardless of sort of their different takes on strategy. So anyway, I just wanted to get that in there because I know it was something that I thought would be valuable to get in there.
So as you were dealing with this movie and building this movie, I keep thinking about, okay, so if you were able to get education to these places, and these people started collaboratively working together, maybe, you know, they create a solution where somebody goes out once a month and gets all the groceries and distributes, and I think it's a collaborative issue. But I thought from an educational standpoint, what did you learn about access to internet and ways in which families could be trained or get educated? What did you find out? What would be the solution on the education side? Is there access to, you know, the internet in these areas, these food deserts, where people can learn collaborative strategies for buying groceries or how to cook more effectively, many video clips, stuff that could be part of the movie that would train people and then educate them? Any comment on that?
One of the things that I will say is later this spring, the program that I run, Cooking Matters, is actually going to be putting out a smartphone app. And it initially got a lot of flack when people were talking about it. And as we kind of said, you know, all of the practitioners of our program across the country said, you know, these families that we're working with, they come in with smartphones because that's their internet connection. That was something that was very interesting, I think, for a lot of people to think about. They're like, whoa, they don't actually have broadband connections in their homes. That's way too cost prohibitive. But you can actually get, pretty much anybody will hand you a free smartphone now with a minimal contract that actually enables families to get some of the connections. So it's not a bad idea by any means for participant education to kind of take an internet-based approach, because there are more and more places where families can get that, even if it isn't in their own home.
That's a great question. Thank you for asking.
One question that I forgot to ask you, Karin, that I just wanted to kind of follow up with as well. I know I asked Kristi this, and I just wanted to see how you balance kind of making films for advocacy versus kind of really exploring the medium of documentaries and really just telling stories to tell stories and utilizing all the conventions of that format versus, you know, just trying to have an impact.
Well, I think that in this film especially, it was a thing that it was a very conscious choice to make sure, well, in all the films really, but in this one, since it is such a topic that has sort of this, you could say, an advocacy branch, or, you know, that's going to go out and make really can make an impact. It was so important to us to have story as a central thing, because, you know, you can sit there and you can watch a lot of people talking about a lot of information, and you can learn a lot of things from that. But I think to actually feel engaged with a film, you need to have some emotional connection to it. And so at least that's my perspective and how I approach filmmaking. And with the story, you're able to create that emotional connection so that it's not just you sitting back and learning stats about something or other, but you're actually getting engaged with what's going on in the story and wanting to either know more or you like the characters or something. So in this one, you know, we had done a lot of great interviews with our experts who are excellent, but we, at a part of the filmmaking, this was before we found the US Uncut thing, we felt, okay, we have great interviews, but we don't have a film, because we didn't have the human action, the people getting involved, the whatever, you know, like their personal stories of the families. And so we sat there and we were at a point in the filmmaking before US Uncut came along that we're just like, okay, we don't have a film. What are we going to do? You know, we're like, we have great interviews and all this great information, but how are we going to construct it and what are we going to do? And we came across that, and then the US Uncut people, a lot of them ended up joining the Occupy movements, and so that was like one more further development in the story aspect for us. So that's key, I think, because without a story, I think that a film can fall flat, or it's maybe not gonna reach people in the way that you you can get engaged. I mean, I know myself when I go to a film, whether it's narrative or documentary, it's the story that grabs me. So.
Great, thank you.
Jim, I just was wondering if you could take that a little further. You know, you talk about resistances to change. Can you, or for both of you, can you talk a little bit about what you're thinking with this film and what kinds of concrete steps you will be taking with the film to address the resistances to campaign finance and the lobby system that's preventing tax justice?
Well, one of the things that, since we're just out of Sundance and this is our first screening, actually after our screening we're going to have a thing where we have a little survey thing to pass around to get ideas from the audience, actually, because a lot of you have probably thought about these things or have ideas of, as an audience member, how would you want to take an action? And so that's going to be a useful thing for us as because we're still in the process of developing it. One of the things that we have been doing is we linked up with a thing called the FACT Coalition, which is a coalition of organizations working on these issues. One of them is US PIRG that we've linked up with, and they have a petition that they've already started. So we have that as, sign a petition, because Senator Carl Levin has he has the Stop Tax Haven Abuse Act, and then he just came out in February with another bill which is about closing corporate tax loopholes, some specific ones. So there are some specific things that are happening on the Senate level, and we're at the place of developing, okay, that's one action somebody can take, but what are some other actions that we can take they're going to have a direct impact? And Jim, you can talk about some of the resistance.
There's a coalition of groups in Washington that's come together for the first time that's called the FACT Coalition, and we're working with lots of different church groups, unions, community groups, and environmental groups like Friends of the Earth, which has 40,000 US members nationwide, to kind of make this as effective a grassroots rollout as possible, not just film festivals or congressional viewings. Those can have some impact, but our thesis is basically there needs to be, and there can be, sort of a mass movement around not only our film but others, that calling attention to these similar issues about representation without taxation, about excessive power on the part of large corporations and influence in Washington. And so, that's an area where we want to engage you and to get other people involved at a grassroots level. I mean, I'd love to see the Harvard Business School, Harvard Law School, all the schools here screening films, having active debates about it, about the issues that we're raising. Is corporate taxation really too high in the United States? That's what some people are telling us on the right, and even the president. Or as we suppose, we desperately need the money and we can afford it, and we should be working with other countries around the world to stop this kind of arms race toward lower taxation globally. There's no answer. Easy answer. We're at the distribution issue. 1937, Spanish Civil War is raging. Hemingway himself makes a film called, with a wonderful producer, called The Spanish Earth, and he has a screening in the White House for Eleanor, and she's very motivated. And then they go to Hollywood and they try to get distribution. And they work for weeks and weeks. Hemingway shows up himself, and at the end of the day, they have 300 theaters in the country that are willing to show this film at that time. So this is an old story in documentary filmmaking. You can make a tremendously timely film that's of critical social importance. The country is really crying out for it, but at some level, we have not got the answer that we need to get this, this film out there, even though it's potentially of importance to every single American. So we need your help, ideas, sort of grassroots response.
I have one final question for the panel, and I'm going to be looking for short answers from each of you because we are between now and lunch. And it's the question that I raised at the end of my remarks this morning, and the segue of just what was said is the perfect one. Okay, you're at Harvard University, and we have an obligation here. It's just what I talked about earlier. I'd really like some advice from each one of you, including you, Peter, as an alumni. Is what more can we do besides just screening the films and talking about the subject? What can we do to embed this use of film and the artistic expression within the policy arena and within the action arena? What can I do within my curriculum and with faculty, et cetera? So I'd like, really looking forward to your answer and sitting down and getting notes.
Anybody want to jump in?
Sure. I'm a moderator, so I'm not supposed to answer any questions. That
So
wasn't
it's
that
your
wasn't
role
in
to give
my
us some
contract, I
time.
don't think. It's a great question, and I'm here because I absolutely believe in the potential for films to have an impact and to change the world. I think that the stories that we tell in filmmaking are as old as civilizations and kind of the Joseph Campbell sense. And the more we understand about each other, the more likely we are to work together to impact change, to solve our common problems, and to come together and try to make the world a better place. And films have always resonated with me and reinforced values that I don't see being reinforced in other ways. And with kind of the decline of a lot of the social fabric of our society, some of the things that we're looking at in terms of taxes and in terms of welfare and how we value things, I think that documentaries and these films and these stories are ways that people are standing up for values that they don't see being taken care of in other areas of their life. And we all have a responsibility, and I think that a lot of people are here, a lot of people are studying at Harvard or looking at making films because they want to make a difference. And one of the ways that we can do that is through storytelling. It's hard to, and I think Jim touched on this well, as a documentary filmmaker. The last film I did, I spent 3 years making it in 20 countries on 4 continents, and it took me a year to get it distributed. It was almost like a $2 million homework project. And I ended up getting really lucky, and PBS bought the worldwide rights to it, and it's been distributed in like 25 countries now. But it's really rare. I don't know what the statistic is, but it's probably 95% of the films that are made or documentaries don't ever see the light of day, don't get to get out and have an impact. And with the access that we have to internet and to kind of free media and how easy it is to kind of get the word out there today with social media, I just think that if these are topics that resonate with you, if you're so moved to do something about it, there's lots of ways that you can get involved. You can, like they were talking about with Small Acts, which moved me incredibly when we watched it 2 years ago. It's a remarkable film. You can make a donation. You can stand up or just recognize it on Facebook. You can tweet about it, or you can get involved with a local charity, or you can write your congressman or senator. And sometimes it's the little things that make a difference and lead us towards having a greater impact in the world.
Go
I
ahead.
have something. This is something like this may exist, but I was just thinking about this as you asked the question. And since each film comes out and really has to find its own path through this finding an impact, and although there's a lot of models of films that have done it, which are very helpful to explore and to look at, one idea, this is just sort of brainstorming ideas, if there's a way for organizations, nonprofits or whatever, that would want to be connected to a film in some way, to have some sort of central database where they could go and sign up so that a filmmaker, okay, I'm making a film on X, Y, or Z, I can go to this database and I can look up all the organizations who are related to my topic. Because I know even now, I'm still learning about organizations that I may not have heard of, and I'm learning through word of mouth or research on the internet, but it seems like everything's scattered. And if there was a way that could help films and filmmakers go to a place when they're trying to link up with partner organizations, I don't know, it may already exist, but that's just one idea of something that could be helpful to make the process a little bit maybe more streamlined, or so you're not so that every film isn't reinventing the wheel every single time, trying to find out who are those organizations that might want to partner with this topic.
I would say that, first of all, I think just acknowledging the important relationship between filmmaking and storytelling and having an impact and having a forum like this is certainly something that is valuable, I think. We were talking with Jim last night about, you know, the sort of economics of filmmaking and documentaries, and so my request would be that you guys work together with Jim to come up with a study that reveals just how valuable, perhaps more valuable than dollars, making films and getting them out there and impacting individuals one by one, or by the tens and 20s and hundreds of thousands. You know, that might be something. But I'm volunteering Jim.
Happy to do it for nothing.
And one other thing is that you said other than screening the films, and screening the films and having conversations both are so important, and also screening the films with audiences that are perhaps the most vulnerable or that are featured in the films. I think that's really, really important, and that happens a little bit less than we'd like. And for example, Alicia was telling me that Witnesses to Hunger, the group that you saw in our film, is going to be having an exhibit in the State House here later this month. And and they're starting to gather a group of witnesses that are here in the Boston area. And so sort of tapping into having not just this film, but all these films reach greater audiences through the mechanism that exists here, which is Harvard, which has such great reputation, and obviously hands and legs and tentacles all over the place. So.
I just have a quick comment, speaking kind of public interest of an organization, I would be curious whether there could be anything that potential filmmakers could do to help nonprofits tell their story better. You don't need to watch a short little video on what Cooking Matters is or what Share Our Strength is. You need to watch a person who has been affected by it. That's the story that's probably going to carry a lot farther. And I think with many organizations and nonprofit groups, we get into that thing of, we tell you what we do and how we do it because we want you to understand it. But if we could get you to actually get to the issue and make that resonate and get that connection, you're going to connect to the person more than you are to the organization. But that personal connection is probably going to open a much larger door. So I don't know if that could be a student project, but
or part of the database.
Storytelling, yes.
There are lots of things that people should be doing and can be doing on a small scale, but I think one of the things that's always struck me about, that we had this discussion about measuring success this morning, and all the kind of wonderful work that's being done on trying to measure impact. There's a story about William James, who was a professor of psychology here in the 1890s, walking across the Harvard campus, and the president of Harvard stops him and he says, "Professor James, how are your courses going?" Professor James says, "Well, students seem very engaged, and they're lively and they're creative and they're working very hard." And he says, No, Professor James, how many students do you have in your course?" And I think we've missed something important here about the power of the film if we don't recognize that a lot of the impacts that we're going to be having are not just scale or numerical. They're people who will see these films and change what they do for a living and dedicate their lives to doing something differently that they wouldn't have done. If we have 10 people like that who come out of this audience or just say, "This is an issue I need to dedicate the next year or two," that would be terrific. It's not just simply a number of people. But, anyway,
All right, well, thank you very much, and can we please thank our panel for such a wonderful conversation?